Now, in order to output some useful information in this results screen here, we now have to kind of combine the chosen answers with the questions that we have in this separate questions.dart file. And for that, I'll add a new method here to results screen, and I'll introduce you to a new data type. But let's start with the method. I'll add a method called getSummaryData. The name, of course, as always, is up to you. And in this method here, I want to return a list of values, but now not a list of strings or a list of widgets, but instead a list of so-called maps. And that's now not a map as in Google Maps, but instead in programming, a map is a very simple data structure that maps values to keys. And in Dart, map, just like list, is actually a generic type, where you specify the type of your keys and the type of your values. So we need another pair of opening and closing angle brackets here. Therefore, we have some nested angle brackets here, which is absolutely something you can have in Dart. And this inner pair of angle brackets now belongs to map. And for my keys, I'll have a bunch of strings. So the keys in my map will simply be string identifiers. But for the values, I'll have different types of values. I will have strings and also numbers for these different keys. And therefore here, the second type I specify for this map generic type, after this comma here, which is the type of values that will be stored in this map, should be object, written like this with a capital O. Since all values in Dart are objects in the end, this is a pretty flexible type that actually allows all kinds of values. And this allows me to store different kinds of values in this map here, so that this map can simply be used as a data structure that groups different kinds of key value pairs together. Alternatively, we could create a brand new class that defines how our summary objects should look like, and then we could instantiate a bunch of summary objects here, and that would definitely also be a great approach. But I also want to introduce you to this map value and type, and that's why I'm using this approach here. So getSummaryData should return such a list of maps. Now to generate this list here, I'll start with an empty list, which I'll store in a variable, or in a final variable to be precise, called summary. And the type of this list here should be this type, since in the end I plan on returning summary here. But of course, in between creating it as an empty list and returning it, I also want to populate that list. And for that, we'll use a new Dart feature which we haven't seen before. We'll create a for loop. Now, earlier in this section, we saw if statements to run some code conditionally. And if statements are so-called control structures because they allow you to control the code execution flow. Another kind of control structure supported by Dart and many other programming languages as well are for loops. With the for keyword, you create such a loop, and a for loop simply allows you to execute a certain code snippet multiple times. To do that, you also add parentheses here, and between these parentheses, you add your for loop configuration, so to say. This configuration consists of 3 parts. The first part is a helper variable that's created for this loop. Typically, this variable is called I, but the name is up to you, and it's set to an initial value. Very often, that value will be 0, but any value can be used here. Then thereafter, you add a semicolon, so not a comma, but a semicolon, which might look like a strange place, since thus far we always used semicolons at the end of lines. Now we're using it here in the middle of a line, but that is just how the for loop must be defined. And we continue with the next piece of configuration for the for loop. And that next piece of information that we have to add here is a condition that controls how long this loop should keep on running. For that, you typically use this helper variable here, I, And here I want to keep on running as long as I'm still processing chosen answers. So as long as I is smaller, and that's a new kind of comparison operator, which you haven't seen before, but just as two equal signs can be used to check for equality, smaller can be used to check whether this value on the left side is smaller than the value on the right side. And the value on the right side here should be my chosen answers, and there the length of this list, which also will be a number, just like I. So now with this code, the loop here, which we are about to define, will keep on running as long as I is smaller than the length of my chosen answers. So if I have 6 answers in this list, this will be true as long as I is smaller than 6, which it initially will be since we initialize it to 0. And therefore, we also need a third part here when configuring this list, where we actually control how I should change after every iteration. Because if it never changes, we create an infinite loop, since I then would always be smaller than the length of this list. Therefore, here you then control how I should change, and typically you increment I by 1 by using this ++ shortcut here. You could also set it to I plus 1 like this manually, but this is simply shorter. And then you add opening and closing curly braces, and between those curly braces, you have your loop body, you could say. And that will be the code that will be repeated until this condition here is not met anymore. And in here, between these curly braces, I now want to add items to this list here. So for that, I reach out to this summary list and call the add method to add items to it. And as you learned, you can do this on final lists. Just reassigning this to a new value wouldn't work, but calling add will work. And the value I want to add here is such a map. So such a simple collection of pieces of data, of key value pairs to be precise. And in Dart, such a map is created by using opening and closing curly braces. Now, of course, we have also already used these curly braces a couple of times in other parts of the code. For example, for this loop body or to mark the body of a function. But it can also be used in places where a value is expected, like here for this add method, to create a map. Because this is the Dart syntax for creating a map value. Now between those opening and closing curly braces, you then put your different key value pairs. And here you can add any keys of your choice as long as they are of type string. So for example, we could add a key named question_index and then set this equal to a value by adding a colon, not an equal sign. Inside of a map, you use a colon to separate the name from the value. For variables, you use an equal sign. In a map, it's a colon. And on the right side of the colon, you set the value for this key in this map. And here for question index, my value would be I. Because I'm going through all my answers, and as mentioned earlier in this section, we'll have as many answers as we have questions. So implicitly, with that loop, we're also going through all the questions, kind of. And I will change after every iteration. So therefore, it will initially be 0. And for the next iteration, it will be 1, and then 2, and so on. And therefore, I here can be used to reflect the index of the question for which we're adding some summary data to this list here. But of course, the question index is not all. Hence, you should add a comma, and then thereafter the next key value pair that should be added to this map. And the next key could be question, to add the actual question text to this summary object. And I'm creating these summary objects so that thereafter I'll have an easier time outputting all these summary statistics. So here the question text is next. And for this, we can now access the questions, so not the chosen answers, but the questions that are stored in this question start file. And to access this, we of course have to import this file. So in this results screen Dart file, we import package advanced basics data questions.dart, as we did in many other files as well. And with that here, for this question key, and I'll add some commas to get proper formatting. So for this questions key, I want to set this equal to questions, but then not to the entire questions list, but one specific question text. So for that, I access a specific question by its index, I, which is in the end based on my chosen answers. But since we populate these answers based on our questions in the questions screen in the end, I can also safely access my questions with this index here. And then, of course, I want to get the text here for a question, because this question key should store the question text. Then I also want to store the correct answer. And that's now why it was important to not shuffle the original answers list, because now I rely on the fact that the first answer in here is still the correct answer. So that here in results screen, we can set correct answer equal to questions, I, for the current question, for this current iteration, dot answers, and then 0. Always the first answer, because as mentioned, these answers in these dummy questions are set up such that the first answer is always the right one. And last but not least, I want to add one last piece of information to this map, so to this data collection here. And that would be the user answer, so the answer chosen by the user. And here we want to access chosen answers and then the index I. Because we're looping through all the chosen answers, so step by step we get the different chosen answers. And with that, after we went through all the chosen answers, we'll have a summary list full of such map objects, which we can now use to output our summary statistics down there.